Hello and welcome to the North Shore Drive podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. We've got Ray Fittipaldo on today. It's time to look back at the Steelers draft class. Did they do enough to address the run defense? We know that they picked Derrick Harmon and Jack Sawyer as two of their top three picks. We'll talk about that. Also, how did they handle the quarterback situation? Did they do it the right way? And we got to talk about a major Pittsburgh head coach was fired in Mike Sullivan. What does that say about Mike Tomlin's future in the city? We talk about all that here on the North Shore Drive podcast. Let's get into it.
You are now listening to the North Shore Drive podcast, a show on all things Pittsburgh sports from the writers of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, hosted by Christopher Carter.
Hello and welcome to the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. I'm your host, Chris Carter, here with Ray Fittipaldo, and as always, you can find the show on your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoyed, subscribe to this channel to get all of your Monday, Wednesday, Friday episodes of the North Shore Drive podcast, as well as the daily content that comes out from all of our sports writers here at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. And as always, this show is brought to you by Edgar Snyder Associates. If you're ever injured in an accident or you need help with workers' compensation, call Edgar Snyder Associates at 1-800-94-EDGAR. There's never a fee unless they get money for you. Ray! The draft is in the books, friend. How you feeling? Because it's always a grind to get through it to this point.
Yeah, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, always long days, especially Saturday, Chris. I know that was the first time you experienced that in the room. There's a lot of downtime in between picks. But, it's finally in the books, and we get to talk about guys who are actually going to be here in a week or two at rookie minicamp.
Yeah, I got to say that was actually my first time being in the Steelers facility on like one of the days of the draft. I'm always either doing a live stream or somewhere else doing work and breaking down the film and doing all that. So it was kind of cool to be in the building. But I was like, yeah, these days are long when you sitting up in there, especially on that third day of the draft when you're going through the last 4 rounds and you're just sitting there like, oh boy, and then you got to do undrafted free agents. It's a slog, but. Let's talk about this draft class. One of the things that we said was of prime importance to the Steelers, and I pat all the backs of our writers here at the Post-Gazette. We all thought they were going D tackle. You and Brian, though, picked Derrick Harmon to be their picks. You were correct. Me and Jerry thought it was going to be Kenneth Grant. He went 13th overall to the Dolphins. Ray, with the additions of Derrick Harmon and Jack Sawyer, who I think less of an impact right away, but is at least helping the depth of the outside linebacker position, especially with the run defense. Do you think the Steelers have done enough to say that they could be a better run defense next season? They also added Dan Aquale during the offseason.
Yeah, and don't forget about Yahya Black in the 5th round.
And Yahya Black, correct.
From Iowa. So, I get your point. I tweeted this after they drafted Black. I listed the 11 defensive linemen who are on the roster now. You know they're not going to carry 9 or 10 or 11 defensive linemen. They're probably going to carry 7 or 8. 8 probably max if they want to go to a deep rotation. And, some guys with NFL experience are not going to be on the 53-man roster.
Mm-hmm.
Guys like Isaiah Loudermilk are going to have to scrap and claw to get on that roster this year. Dean Lowry, who is still here, a veteran, probably a guy who's going to have to make the team with a strong training camp. So there's a lot of competition. They're certainly throwing numbers at it, and you understand why. Mike Tomlin and Omar Khan both talked about it after the draft. This draft was all about physicality, not just with defensive line, but Mike even mentioned receiver and running back. But for now, we'll talk about the defensive line. Chris, you give up 300 yards in a playoff game to the Baltimore Ravens. You are going to drastically do things different. They obviously were not happy with that game. But as we've talked about in weeks past, they were not happy with the way the second half of that season unfolded. Chris, go back to that game in Philadelphia where, the Steelers were, a Najee Harris fumble away from actually being in that game in the second half. But the Philadelphia Eagles controlled the ball for almost 11 minutes to close out that football game. When you think about that, when you think about the Ravens playoff game, this was a roster that had to be retold, and they tried to do that with the additions of Derrick Harmon, Yahya Black, and yes, certainly to a certain extent, Jack Sawyer as well.
I think that's certainly a part of the interesting thing. I thought it was really interesting when we got a chance to talk to Carl Dunbar about the defensive line, and he was asked about the depth that the Steelers had brought in on the defensive line. And he said, it's about competition. If you want to eat, go take your food. That's what it's all about. I do think this is a message to everyone on the Steelers defensive line past Cam Heyward and Keenau Benton. Your position is not safe. You better come to work. You better look to, these are some young dudes we're bringing in here. Equali's also been brought in. I think he's more of a run defender than a pass rusher as well. I think this is the Steelers sending a message like, look, this D-line has to be a lot sharper from top to bottom. And, I think it's interesting, though, that Carl Dunbar said that he still sees Benton as their nose. And Yahya Black is more of a four-tech, kind of like Cam Heyward and Derrick Harmon are expected to be. So they're expecting him to be more of like that 3-4 DN more than the nose tackle type of role. But it's going to be interesting to see where everyone falls into place, because the way I look at it, the 3-4 isn't used as much anymore. That's a base defense that just the team doesn't use, because a lot of teams come out in shotgun and 3 receiver sets and things like that. But I see the rotation of, if you're looking at a 4-man front, it's the outside linebackers are still your edge rushers, but your first 2 interior defensive linemen are Benton and Heyward, and then you're gonna have Harmon on that second rotation. But then it's gonna be interesting to see who's on the line next to Harmon in that first group of guys that come off the bench. Is it Yahya Black? Is it Loudermilk? Is it Dean Lowry? Is it who is it? And is it Equale? That's where the competition, I think, is going to be really interesting, because the Steelers need guys that are going to be physical, pushing offensive linemen, being first off the ball, getting their hands there. And that's something that I thought that Derrick Harmon did a pretty good job of. When you look at his tape, he is really athletic. He gets off the ball. He gets his hands on guys, and he talked about when I asked him at the combine, he talked about how he worked to attack the hands and elbows of an offensive lineman to keep them from getting their hands on him, because that's the best way to slow down his attack. And he said he modeled. He said when I look to study run defenders, I look to study Cam Heyward. Now he can do that up close and do that in the Pittsburgh locker room. I think that's going to be something that could translate sooner rather than later for the Steelers.
I think a deeper rotation helps everyone. You look at Cam Heyward, all-pro year in his age 35 year. But I think anyone, whether you're 25, 30, or 35, you will benefit if you have to play fewer snaps, because you're going to have more juice later in the game. I think Cam Heyward is a unicorn. What he did last year, you shouldn't be able to do when you're 35 years old. So, Derrick Harmon's role is to be determined. Obviously, he's Cam's future replacement, but he's going to play some in the sum packages. I think it's going to be, you're going to probably look from game to game about how they are going to use that rotation, because, listen, if you're playing the Baltimore Ravens, Chris, I could see Daniel Equale and maybe Yahya Black having a bigger role, right? Those guys are going to be in there. They're run defenders, and they are going to clog up the middle, and they could be useful in those types of games. And then there might be other games where you're playing, let's say the LA Rams, whoever's going to throw the ball a lot. You could see other guys like the Marvin Leal or any of those other guys who are maybe more, pass rush specialists, or have maybe more pass rushing skills in their tool belt at this stage of their career. So obviously Harmon's going to play and hopefully play quite a bit for them, but there's going to be great competition when you talk about sorting out those other 3, 4, 5 spots in that rotation.
I agree with you. I think that was they wanted to address this as much as possible. We said they would double dip. They double dipped. They got a guy Derrick Harmon, who was one of the best guys that we projected to be part of this class. They got Yahya Black, who was a person who we thought could be one of the better run defender late picks of this class, and both of them were top 30 visits that they brought in. We will talk about Caleb Johnson later this week, but I want to talk to you about the quarterback position next, because that's the thing that when we were doing our live stream, we literally heard people yelling at Mike's Beer Bar when they weren't taking a quarterback, because Pittsburgh was so sure. If you did not pay attention to the Post-Gazette coverage, they were so sure the Steelers were taking quarterback. We told you otherwise. And so we're going to talk about that, about how they handled this. Did they handle this the right way by getting Will Howard in the 6th, and what they have going forward at the quarterback position? All here next on the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. But first, I want to remind you this show is brought to you by Edgar Snyder Associates. If you ever need help with workers' compensation, there's no better place to call. When you've been hurt on the job, you need to know who decides when you're better, and who decides when your treatment is over, and who decides when your benefits are over. The answer might surprise you. It's the insurance company's doctors. They won't be on your side, but you know who will be? Edgar Snyder Associates. You got to call them today at 1-800-94-EDGAR, because they will fight for all your workers' compensation rights that you deserve. And remember, there's never a fee unless they get money for you. We're back here on the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Chris Carter, Ray Fittipaldo. Ray, let's talk about quarterback, because I think there was so much noise nationally that the Steelers were so into quarterback. They were going to draft Shedeur Sanders. They were going to draft Jaxson. They're going to draft all these quarterbacks in the first round, and then none of them happened. And not only did none of them happen, they didn't happen in the 3rd round. They didn't happen in the 4th round. They didn't happen in the 5th round. It happened in the 6th round, where they got Will Howard, the Ohio State quarterback. Now, I had been slotting Will Howard to the Steelers a lot. Now, I know some people, want to see Will Howard as different things. I've been saying for the past 2 months, this is the draft of the backup quarterback. This is not the franchise quarterback draft. I thought there were plenty of guys that fit that, and I thought Will Howard was one of the better profiles for it, especially for the Steelers, because when you look at his measurables, his height, his weight, his throwing motion, his different intangibles, he measures a lot to be, and looks a lot, when I want to study him on tape, like Mason Rudolph. And what a better way to get, if you get Mason Rudolph 2.0, who's been a very good backup quarterback for the Steelers. He's filled in. They brought him back. They feel comfortable with him right now. It made a lot of sense to get Will Howard. And personally, I think getting him in the 6th round was great value, because I valued him as like a 4th round pick.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at it, Chris, it's funny how it worked out, because if you pay attention to what the Steelers do in the pre-draft process, it provides you a lot of clues for how they're going to team build. So they brought in, 9 running backs and 8 defensive linemen, right? And those were the first 2 picks. I think if you wanted to say the next heavily scouted position after those 2, undoubtedly it was quarterbacks. I think they brought 4 in, but they also went to Ohio State's pro day, Notre Dame's, Texas's, Alabama's as well. So that was really their third most focus was on the quarterbacks. But it just goes to show you, if it's not a good class for those guys, you're going to be selective in who you bring onto your football team. So they weren't just going to draft one in the 3rd round or the 4th round. This is a type of class where you can wait on guys. I mean, look at Quinn Ewers. He didn't go until the 7th round. And that's a guy who I think had an $8 million offer from an unnamed school to come back and transfer and play college football for 1 more year. So, tough decision for him. But this class was what we thought it was all along. It was a below average class. And I think the Steelers approached it perfectly. They needed a quarterback to fill out their roster. They got Will Howard, who has some potential. If he's a backup, that's fine. If he develops into something else, that's fine too. You take a shot on a guy, but their focus was and should be on 2026, because it's a much better class overall. There is more quality depth, and there are better players at the top as well.
Right, and that's a list that's not set, of course. When you look at the potential guys that could be there, but some of the names that have been floated around, of course, Arch Manning out of Texas, the next in the line of the long line of Manning quarterbacks, he's there. And I know everyone looks at him, but I think a lot of people project Arch Manning, if he goes in next year's draft, he'll be the 1st overall pick, and that'll be out of the Steelers territory. But other guys like Drew Allard out of Penn State, Lenore Sellers out of South Carolina, Garrett Nussmeier out of LSU, Cade Klubnik out of Clemson, Nico Iamaleava Alba, who had his whole series episode with Tennessee and now is with UCLA. Carson Beck out of Georgia. There's a lot of guys that can fit that bill there. And again, we need to see how these guys all play because like Carson Beck was expected to come out this year. He didn't. Some of these players might not play as well, and their profile might look a little bit different this time next year. Or there could be some names that we don't have on this that I didn't name at all, like Jaxson Arnold at Auburn. He could turn into a superstar. There's always different guys that spike up at the last moment, and you're thinking, oh wow, they're certainly in the world. Like Jackson Dart was not a person that I was even paying attention to before this season, and so there's always those things. So I agree, quarterback is certainly the look next year. But Ray, let's talk about the name that everyone kept pairing with the Steelers for months that you and I were kind of like, we don't see it. We don't know. We don't think it's going to happen. And it was Shedeur Sanders, the Colorado quarterback, son of Deion Sanders. Mike Tomlin spoke about him during the Steelers pre-draft press conference when him and Omar Khan were spoken. He spoke glowingly about him. But we were all kind of like, yeah, we see a smoke screen here. Like I'm sure that they like parts of his game and they know how to speak positively about him. But the Steelers, not only did they not like him in the first round, they didn't like him in the third round. They didn't like him in the fourth round or the fourth round either. And I thought the value that I had on Shedeur Sanders, because like some people like Mel Kiper thought he was the second best player in the draft. Like he should just be gone. And Mel Kiper was just foaming at the mouth on ESPN all weekend long. Guys like Ryan Clark thought the Steelers should have taken him there. But I thought that if they were going to get Shedeur Sanders, the sweet spot was the fourth round, but they saw that as they need a backup edge rusher at that position. How do you think this played out? Do you think that there was a dropping of Shedeur Sanders, or was this just always where he should have gone, and maybe there was just a little bit too much national hype on his name?
Yeah, I think too much national hype. I think he's, unfortunately for Shedeur, he's not unlike a lot of the quarterbacks in the NFL right now. You have your elite guys who are top 5, top 10, and there's a lot of guys like Shedeur Sanders who are, average arm strength. But, in Shedeur's case, he knows how to run offense. He's a good processor. Unfortunately for Shedeur, and people have a hard time wrapping their heads around this, he's the son of Deion Sanders, but he's not a tremendous athlete. So, there were a bunch of quarterbacks in this draft who are better runners and better athletes, could escape pressure more than Shedeur Sanders can. So when you think about that, he's not a first-round prospect. Then you get to the point, okay, if he's going to come in and be a backup for a couple of years, if he's going to be a guy that we want to develop, is it worth the headache of having his family pop off, when things aren't going well for him? A guy who is all about the brand as a backup quarterback. I mean, you look around the NFL, what's Mason Rudolph's brand, Chris? I mean, he's just he's a grinder. And as backup quarterbacks, you want those guys to be grinders. When it's their time to be called upon, they got to come in and perform. It's just there are a lot of distractions with having a guy like Shedeur Sanders as a backup quarterback. So I think when NFL teams evaluated him, they realized he wasn't a surefire starter. They kind of looked around and said, how are we going to handle this guy? I mean, the Steelers had a hard time dealing with guys like Juju Smith-Schuster and Chase Claypool because they were all about the brand. I mean, there's a thing in football, Chris, where let's become a good football player first, and then you worry about your brand, right? Like Chase Claypool was never a good football player, and he was all about his brand. I could tolerate Juju for a while because he was a really good football player for a while. And then when he wasn't a good football player anymore, or at the level he was in 17 or 18, then it's like, okay, why are we letting this guy dance on the Bengals logo and become a distraction when he's not that good? So there's always a point where these guys are more trouble when they're worth. And I think we just saw early on in the process that NFL teams didn't think Shedeur was worth the trouble.
Yeah, and I mean, there was that clip with Shedeur Sanders, like you see what you were talking about, where like it was him and Cam Ward, I think, working out on the same field, and he was like, "Hey, man, you want to make a song together?" And Cam Ward was like, "I'm about football, man," and like it's like, dang. Well, one guy went first overall, one guy went to the 5th round, and Cam Ward's a guy that had like before this year. That's not before. That's not. I wouldn't say before this year because there was a lot going into the season. There was some hype on him, but Cam Ward was a guy who was barely recruited out of college. He had to earn his way to eventually become a transfer guy that Miami wanted to pay a lot of money for in NIL. And he brought in, and then he lit it up this past year and was like, I'd say by the end of September, everyone was like, okay, yeah, he's probably going to go first overall because of just how good he was playing. He measures up. He has good arm strength. He has good athleticism. He put together a lot of things there. Shedeur Sanders didn't have a lot of those traits, and you had the factor like that as well. It also, noteworthy that a lot of people have come out and said that it was obvious. Him and Deion Sanders said they're not talking to certain teams. You can't not talk to teams when you're not. Like, I get Travis Hunter doing that. Travis Hunter was the best wide receiver corner option in the draft. Was a very unique prospect. Everyone said that guy's going top 5. I think that the Sanders family thought Shedeur was going top 5 and mistakenly thought so. And if you're not going top 5, you better be taking every interview possible. I think that's why Tyler Shuck went in the second round. He went throughout the draft process. He impressed people. He took it seriously, and people were like, "Hey, we'll give that the Saints, like, we'll bring him into our locker room because we've established that rapport with him." I think that Shedeur didn't do that, and that's why the Steelers are probably like, you know what, we're not feeling it. We're gonna go with some other options here. But yeah, and this is not to say Shedeur Sanders won't be good in the NFL. Maybe he will be. Maybe he'll rock people out of here. But I think that, again, the whole reason why the whole thing the Steelers were looking for was they knew that this class, like you said, like I said, like we've all been saying, this was not the year to reach and try to go get a quarterback, because this was not the year to go get a franchise guy. It was the year to get a backup guy, and they got their guy in Will Howard.
Yeah, and let this be a lesson as we all look ahead to the 2026 class. You mentioned Arch Manning. A year ago at this time, it wasn't Cam Ward who was the number 1 overall pick projected. It was Shedeur Sanders. Like, Shedeur Sanders was viewed as the top quarterback. And that just goes to show you so much can change in a year's time. We're going to hear about all these guys. We're going to hear about Arch Manning and Nussmeier and Sellers and all these guys. Let's let the season play out. I mean, Chris, Arch Manning has started 2 games in his college career. Like, I know his grandfather and his uncles were number 1 overall picks, but in the NFL, in the eyes of NFL evaluators, he's got to go out and earn that right. And it's going to be a fascinating college football season to watch. You probably rattled off 7 names early. There's not going to be 7 quarterbacks drafted in the first round, but it could be like last year. You could have 5, and you could have 5 in the first 11. So it's going to be a fun 2025 college football season, and let the speculation start now, because Steelers fans know whether they're in the top 10 because they had a poor record, or whether they're going to have to trade up to get one and maneuver their way up the draft board. 2026 is the year that I think everyone hopes they go out and get that future franchise quarterback.
And what I've seen it would be is that draft will be in Pittsburgh on the North Shore, and we'll be on hand to cover it all. It's going to be a long process there, but we got to take a quick break. We come back, we're going to take a break from talking about the draft. We're going to talk about big news in Pittsburgh, and that was the letting go of Mike Sullivan by the Pittsburgh Penguins. Longtime Penguins head coach, 2-time Stanley Cup champion. What does that say about Mike Tomlin? Because there's a lot of people that are obviously making parallels between the two. I'll get Ray and my thoughts on here next on the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. But first, I'll remind you, this show is brought to you by UFC Gym. April is Stress Aware this month, and studies show that even one group exercise class a week can significantly reduce stress. There's no better time to move your body and reset your mind than at UFC Gym. However you blow off steam, they've got it. They've got boxing, kickboxing, Zumba, MMA, HIIT, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, muscle makeover, spin, yoga, cardio core, bar, youth classes, and silver sneakers. Ready to feel stronger inside and out? Drop in this week at UFC Gym Market Square or the Waterfront to try a class for free. That's UFC Gym Pittsburgh. We're back here on the North Shore Drive podcast for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Chris Carter, Ray Fittipaldo. Ray, let's take a step back. Now, I'm not going to ask us to put on our hockey hats and pretend like that we're hockey aficionados, that we know a whole lot here. But let's talk about what happened here on the Penguins side of thing. Matt Vensel's doing his job covering that for the PG about the Penguins, and Mike Sullivan have mutually agreed to part ways. He is now moving on. Mike Sullivan, of course, was brought along in the middle of the 2015-2016 season. He came in for Mike Johnston and quickly turned that team into a Stanley Cup champion. They won back-to-back those years. But since then, The Penguins, after those two Stanley Cup runs, had only advanced in the playoffs one time. They haven't made the playoffs for the past 3 straight years, and there was a mutual parting of the ways. And now there's been a large, I wouldn't say large, I'd say loud contingency of Steelers fans who have been saying that they want Mike Tomlin gone for years, because the Steelers, they haven't advanced in the playoffs for 7 seasons, and they're looking. And you look at the Penguins. It was 6 seasons since they advanced in the playoffs, but they also hadn't made the playoffs in the last 3 rounds. For the people that say the wrong Mike was fired from the head coaching positions in Pittsburgh, what say you, Ray Fittipaldo?
I would say Mike Tomlin is signed through the 2027 season, and the Steelers are paying him a lot of money. And honestly, Chris, if that contract wasn't such a big one, I think there would probably be more speculation about Mike Tomlin's job. The thing with Sullivan, and there are some parallels, right? Because Mike Tomlin won a Super Bowl in his second season. Mike Sullivan did it in his second season and had great success the following season. Got 2 for the city of Pittsburgh. And then it's kind of been a struggle. Like the second halves of their tenures have just it's been tough. And there are reasons for that. Like if you look at the Steelers roster, aging, your franchise quarterback hangs it up.
Yep.
An aging defensive roster. They've never really been able to quite sync it up where the offense and the defense were good enough at the same time to make a Super Bowl run. And again, there are parallels with the hockey team as well. Chris Letang, injuries, age, Evgeny Malkin, age, really isn't the same player he was during his prime years. Sidney Crosby's a unicorn. There's never going to be another player like him. That guy can play at a high level until he's probably 45 if he wanted to. I do think in the end, I think the Steelers will eventually get to this point, Chris, but in the end, I think change is sometimes good for franchises when they're struggling like this. I don't know if it's going to improve the team next year, but I do think at some point there's a time where it's right for both sides to walk away. If this was a mutual parting of ways, I could very easily see that happening again in 3 years if the Steelers and Tomlin don't get back to that elite success that he enjoyed early in his career.
No, I agree. Like I think that here's the thing is that when people want to draw this parallel with their Mikes, there's former champion Mikes, they're sitting there. I think part of it is if Mike Tomlin had the last few years that Mike Sullivan had, he would be gone right now. He wouldn't have gotten that extension. Mike Tomlin's made the playoffs 4 times in the last 5 years. That's more times in my adult life. That's more times than the Pirates have made the playoffs in my adult life. That's also more times than the Penguins have made the playoffs in the last 5 years. In fact, the Penguins have had 3 straight years where they've had losing records and they've missed the playoffs, and they've kept that core together that they thought would make them highly competitive. If the Steelers were coming into their 3rd straight season without a winning record, and that's Mike Tomlin has never allowed the team to sink below that. If they had not made the playoffs for 3 straight years, and that was going into when Mike Tomlin got his extension, I fully believe they would have said, all right, Mike, thank you for your services. But, you look back at how the Rooneys handled Bill Cowher's extension. I believe it was after the 2000 season when he got extended. And that was after his initial run. He hadn't done a whole lot. He was going on his 3rd straight year where he missed the playoff. But he rallied his team from being a 6-10 team in 1999 to being a 9-7 team in 2000. And they thought, okay, there's something building there. They extended him. And then you got that initial push in the early 2000s where Casey Hampton come in. They brought in James Ferrier, and then eventually they brought in Palomalu and Ben, and that was the rest was history. But yeah. I think it's often about, I think people misunderstand that oftentimes it's about how are the coaches, what are the coaches getting out of these players? Because I think when you look at how Bill Cowher was talking to that team, the Steelers 2000 team was not a great team, but they played hard for Bill Cowher. You look at the Steelers team these past few years. The Steelers have been a roster that some people have predicted should have been in the bottom of their division. They shouldn't have even been able to compete for the playoffs, and yet they always have. I think that's what Mike Tomlin still has going for him that the Rooneys believe in. Like you said, the contract is a big protecting factor. But again, he recently signed that extension. So I think that's why he's sticking around. Whereas Mike Sullivan, you can see, guy's been a great coach. He'll always have a piece of Pittsburgh history. But these guys were not able to show it up enough to even have a winning record or to hover around having a winning record. And I think that's the biggest problem you had here.
Yeah, well, think about how hard it is for organizations and franchises to move on from championship winning coaches, right? Dan Bylsma won the Stanley Cup in 2009. 2010, they had a really good team. They get knocked out at home in Game 7, second round against the Canadians. Similar stories, 11 and 12 and 13 too. And you look back on it, and it's like maybe they should have moved on from Bylsma earlier. Maybe that was a move that was waited on, for too long. So, it is interesting. No one really knows the time, but I do think if you're Art Rooney and you're in that front office and you look, okay, Mike has done this for us. He won a championship. We're there every year. He knows how to win football games. The unknown of trying to go out and find a new coach, I think, is daunting for them and for a lot of other people who run organizations. And it's funny, like the Penguins went against the grain of the NHL culture for so long, right? Like they change NHL coaches. They change coaches all the time. I mean, it's
Bilbo was promoted in the middle of a season where they were the worst team in hockey, and then he went to be a champion.
And he gets them into the playoffs, and they win. It's a different sport, but the cultures, pointing out the difference in cultures is important because for a decade now that Mike Sullivan, the Penguins had that stability that the Steelers always have, right? So I think in the end, the Rooneys are always going to crave that stability, but you and I both know eventually it's going to happen, and then we just don't know the circumstances, the timing, or when that's going to happen. But eventually, Mike Tomlin and the Steelers will part ways, and then it's going to be interesting to see what direction the franchise goes after that.
It will be interesting to see, because I do think that's the big thing that you're looking at here is what's the direction that the franchise wants to head in, and how these different sports handle the situations. The Penguins in 2 of their last 3 Stanley Cups have come when they fired their head coach mid-season. I can't imagine the Steelers firing Mike Tomlin mid-season, and then I can't think of an NFL team that they even made it to a Super Bowl after cutting their head coach midseason, unless it was like a medical emergency, like John Fox was one. But that wasn't a firing. That was he needed help. That was.
Well, you remember it was a big deal when the Rooneys pulled the trigger on Matt Canada with like 5 games left in the season. That's something that was very out of the ordinary. So, with a head coach, there would have to be such extraordinary circumstances for that to happen with the Steelers. They're just all about the stability, Chris. They like having that as part of their culture. And I think it's one of the reasons that they're one of the NFL's flagship franchises. It's 3 coaches since 1969. I know a lot of people on the national scene always quote that. People around here are sick about hearing about that, but it's a thing. That stability is really important for the Rooneys, and they think it's a big part of their success.
Absolutely. He's Ray Fittipaldo. I'm Chris Carter. This has been the North Shore Drive podcast, the Monday edition here on from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. As always, you can find the show on your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoy it. Subscribe to this YouTube channel to get all of our Monday, Wednesday, Friday episodes, as well as the daily content that comes out from all of our sports writers here at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. We'll be back Wednesday with more thoughts on this draft class and what the Steelers did here in their draft class right here on the North Shore Drive podcast. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. If you watch this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. For all the sports coverage from the Post-Gazette that we have to offer, visit post-gazette.com.